Hitman 2-3, this is Hitman 2. What's the status? Over. 2-3, stand by. Goliath, this is 2 Bravo. Request permission to engage enemy paratroopers and attempt to snatch a grid Papa uniform 259er, 119er. Break.
Hey, good afternoon, everybody. This is Ben Powers coming at you from the Commander's Voice. My guest today is Mr. Marcus Brotherton. He's the author of Shifty's War, a book that came out about 10 years ago about the famous Shifty Powers, Daryl Powers of the Band of Brothers. But he's also got a brand new book out called Blaze of Light about a Green Beret Special Forces Medal of Honor recipient named Gary Beikirch. And it's just a fascinating story. And we're going to get into all that today. So Marcus, welcome.
Great to be here, Ben.
So my first question is, what got you into writing? Are you a historian who started writing? Are you a journalist? I don't know much about your background. So if you could tell us a little bit about that before we get into the books, I'd love it.
I trained in journalism, and I was in a newsroom for 5 years, and it's kind of crazy because it was right at the time when the newspaper industry was really taking a dive. So I had I was married by then, had a child, and had a mortgage. And so I started moonlighting in the book world, and one thing led to another, and I built up a lot of contacts and a lot of work, and so I went full time into books in '05, and have never looked back.
That's very cool. What was the first book you worked on?
The first military nonfiction book was Call of Duty with Lieutenant Buck Compton, and to give you just a glimpse of how that book came about, I pulled off a couple of other full-length biographies by then, but never anything in the military. And you got to understand, I grew up in Canada, and so it's just a different system up there. So one day my agent calls completely out of the blue, and he said, "Marcus, have you ever seen Band of Brothers?" I said, "Yeah, I love that show. It's great. Miniseries on HBO." He goes, "Well, Lieutenant Buck Compton lives up in your area, and he's interested in writing his memoirs. Needs a collaborative writer to help him out. Would you be interested in working on this project?" I'm like, "Absolutely." I just sort of instantly blurt my response. Don't give it a second thought. Jump at the chance. I hang up the phone, and then in a quieter moment, I'm like, "What have I done?" I don't know anything about the military, right? And so I start to sort of research the genre, and I'm up against, Stephen Ambrose, the, history professor at the University of New Orleans. I'm up against Colonel Cole Kingseed, and just the title Colonel just kind of stops me in my tracks. But fortunately, Buck was just amazing to work with, very patient guy, very just a kind of a benevolent teacher, and just schooled me on his life and everything that happened there. And it was kind of good because the questions that I was asking, I think that book was really clear. I think sort of anybody could read it and enjoy it, and just a great story there. So that led to everything else.
No, that's fantastic. And I found watching interviews with Buck Compton that, granted, you're seeing sort of a lion in winter, and he was, he came across just so patient and so wise. And I don't know if that was because of his career in law afterwards, and he just matured so well. But I was expecting something different, just based off how Neil McDonough played him in the miniseries. And I don't know if you experienced that, spending so much time with him, or were there glimpses of the young paratrooper lieutenant, the young athlete who might have been a little more brash back in the day?
So definitely Buck was a kind of a paradoxical guy. I mean, he was super intelligent, very intense guy, but he presented himself very humble and very laid back, and he was truly both those things. I mean, he just lived this amazing life. He's a child actor with Mickey Rooney. He goes to UCLA, and he's like a double sport athlete. Jackie Robinson is one of his teammates. Goes in through the war with the famed Band of Brothers, gets a Silver Star for his actions at Breakhorn Manor. Comes home, he's a detective, an attorney, and a judge. He ends up prosecuting Sirhan for the murder of Bobby Kennedy. So he's lived just this amazing sort of Forrest Gump life, being everywhere, doing everything. And yet you talk to him, and he's kind of like, "Well, I was just fair to middling. I was a fair to middling baseball player. I was a fair to middling, I wasn't sort of like Dick Winters and sort of the be all and end all, but I did my job. I did my duty." I got the chance to travel with Buck 3 times after his book came out, and he was still speaking all over the country well into his late 80s. He died at age 90. And when he was traveling later in life, he needed a kind of traveling companion to get him through the airports and things like that. And it was during those times we'd be just sitting waiting for a plane or just hanging out in a hotel room watching Sports Center or whatever. And he would just tell these amazing stories, and his memory was so sharp and clear and so smart. But he presented himself so humbly, just the epitome of walking humbly in
That's
everything he did.
that's very cool. So did that lead directly to the opportunity to work with Shifty Powers?
Two books came between then. Yeah, yeah. So I did We Who Are Alive and Remain after Buck Compton. And that was just when Buck did his book, a number of his buddies wanted to write their memoirs as well. And I talked to my agent about it, and there wasn't sort of enough room in the industry, I think, to do a separate book with each guy. And so we ended up doing this compilation memoir. It was like an oral history project with 20 of the still living men from Easy Company. And then I had met a number of the adult age children of the veterans, and particularly the deceased veterans were saying, my dad's got great stories too. And so that led to another book called A Company of Heroes, which was the stories of a number of the deceased veterans from the company.
No, that's
So by the time I'd done that, I thought, wow, I'm done with Band of Brothers. And I didn't I love the Band of Brothers, and they helped me enormously in my career. And yet I didn't sort of want to be sort of pigeonholed into one area. And one day, Margot Johnson called me up, who's the daughter of Shifty Powers, and said, we would love to have you write our father's life story. And I really had to think about it. I called my agent about it. We talked through it. And this is the thing. My agent is like this cut and dried businessman, no nonsense, dollars and cents guy. And he calls me up like 2 days later. He goes, Marcus, you'll never believe this, but I had a dream. I had a dream where I saw you doing this book about Shifty Powers, and I don't get dreams like that. And he's like, you got to do this book. And so I did. So that's how it came to be. And they were just tremendous to work with all the way through. So
Now, I've got a ton of questions about Shifty, but since we've talked about in a Company of Heroes and we talked about We Who Are Alive and Remain, I think both of those projects were tremendous because you could only get so much in the original Band of Brothers book. Obviously, Stephen Ambrose did an amazing job, and if he hadn't done such a great job, we wouldn't have this body of work today that so many other authors have been able to contribute to. We wouldn't have the miniseries. But other than Winters and maybe a few others, everybody only gets a couple pages because it's a relatively short book. And Doc Rowe, I think, appears in it like on 2 pages or something like that, and he was this significant member of the company. So I think it was very cool that these guys who didn't get a lot of time in the miniseries, didn't get a lot of press in the original book, you were able to tell their stories. Now, there's a gap in my knowledge because I haven't read, for example, We Who Are Alive and Remain. But did you find that there was just as rich a vein of material, things that could have been a second miniseries even, that just never made it into the overall, for lack of a better term, mythology of the company because there just wasn't time to show it?
yeah, absolutely. So Forrest Guth, met him in person a couple times, talked on the phone half dozen times. So he is parachuting into Market Garden, into Holland, right? And the guys had all jumped low. I think it was under 500 feet. So he comes down. There's this malfunction in his parachute, and he can't pull his reserve. So he comes down and he lands hard, and he's knocked out. When he comes to, he can't feel his legs. I mean, there's something just seriously wrong. So I think he gets put in a cattle barn for 3 days or something like that until the line moves up, and finally they're able to get him out of there, and they ship him back to England. Turns out he's broken a disc in his back, and gradually he heals up enough just in the hospital where he can walk again, but his legs are still numb. There's a lot of problems still. So the doctor comes to him one day and he says, hey, fantastic, Forrest. This is your golden ticket to go home. Okay, we're putting you on the next boat back, to America. Congratulations, your war is over. But this speaks to the caliber of the men there. Forrest is like, No way. I mean, my brothers are still on the line. There's no way I'm going to leave them there. So he busts out of the hospital, hitchhikes back to his unit, rejoins his unit right before they go and fight in Bastogne.
Yeah, that's absolutely amazing. That's a great story. So thank you for sharing that one for sure. And so this gets us to where you actually wrote Shifty's War. Now, uh, I find Shifty a fascinating, not only a character in the miniseries, but a fascinating man because to me, I know that Dick Winters called Bull Randall like the best soldier in the company kind of thing. To me, Shifty was like the consummate soldier. That he always did what he was asked. Tremendous marksman, but he was the least stereotypical to me. I mean, I was spent 4 years in the airborne. Most of my audience are paratroopers, and there's a swagger that I'm sure you're very familiar with now after interviewing all these men. And Shifty has the competence, he has the courage, but he has the humility that kind of transcends any other aspect of his personality. At least that's how he's portrayed in both the book and in the miniseries. And I'm wondering if, again, was that played up a bit, or is that truly the essence of the man? And if you could elaborate on that, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, 100% the man. I had the chance to talk to Shifty probably a dozen times before he passed. He had cancer at the end, so his time was really short. Fortunately, I was able to fly over to Clinchco. I met all his family members. Pretty funny, I flew into Clinchco. It's like 11 or 12 at night. It's pretty late, middle of winter. Snow is falling, and Shifty's kids pick me up, and we sit in the airport parking lot for like an hour and just telling stories. There's just like this instant connection between the family and myself. Uh, they drove me up to Clinchco. Clinchco is such a small town. There's not even a hotel, a motel in the town, right? They rent a room above like the museum, so that's where I stayed. And that town speaks to who Shifty was. Humble roots, small coal mining town. And he grew up a self-described quote hillbilly in the holler. So he's growing up and they're shooting squirrels as kids because that's one of the family's main food supplies. So he grew up always shooting. He knew his stuff, and some of his humility, I think, stemmed from his confidence. Like he knew how to move through the woods. His father was an excellent shot. That part of the miniseries was right on, and his father taught him to feel the forest. I mean, listen for the rain on the trees, listen for the snow to crunch underneath your feet. Feel what's happening around you and see everything in this sort of 360-degree arc all around you. So Shifty genuinely was a fantastic soldier. He knew his stuff. But because of his roots and just his personality, it's like, I don't have to prove who I am. I'm not trying to be famous. I want to do my job and do it well, and then I want to go home. And that was his the way he operated.
So in the opportunities you did get to speak with him, once again, I'm always looking for the story behind the story. Was there any aspect of Shifty that folks might want to learn more about that, again, because of space or editing, didn't make it into the book?
Hmm. Um, yeah, Shifty. I really, and I use this term carefully, but I grew to love the guy. And the times I talked with him, and he was so like he would phone me, which is really rare. We talked once or twice. I interviewed him in a kind of a small way for We Were Alive and Remain, and then he would call me just to say, how's the book doing? And then he would want to know about my life, which was just amazing. Like there was a genuine empathy, compassion, politeness, heartfelt expression of his persona. So he's a really big reader. And toward the end of his life, he wasn't doing well with his health, and he would listen to books on tape pretty much all day long. And he loved peanut butter cookies, and so that was like one of the few things he could eat toward the end when the cancer was really bad. So he'd call me up, or I'd call him, and usually he'd call me, and I'd say, Shifty, is today a good day for you, or is today a not so good day? And he was really honest. He would say, I'm not feeling great today, but I'm eating a cookie and I'm listening to a book on tape, and that's good. So we talked about different books. And he loved Louis L'Amour, sort of the classic westerns. One of his favorite books to listen to was the Bible. He had listened to the Bible front and back on tape. And then if he had a good day, I would say, Shifty, what does a good day look like for you? And he would say, well, I was able to go and fire my rifle today. And so when I actually got to Klitschko, that story was he lived in a kind of a rural area, and he would go off his back porch, and he had targets set up off his back porch, and that was one of his favorite thing to do, just target practice off his front porch. So actually, when I got to his house, I was able to fire his M1 at a target, which was pretty cool to hold the actual rifle that
That
Shifty had
is
held. So
amazing. That is amazing. Now, I've had the opportunity to speak with other folks who've either written about the Band of Brothers or descendants, as you know, George Lewis Jr., for example. And I always ask this question. I try to be sensitive of it, but there's been a variety of responses. When I spoke with Marianne Malarkey, for example, I know her dad dealt with the consequences of the war for a long time, and he found some healing later in life. Uh, George says his dad didn't appear to have too many difficulties. Did Shifty, was he able to make peace with what he had done as a paratrooper, or did he have to have some struggles before he was able to find some inner calm?
yeah, that's a great question. And yeah, many of the men in that generation, they came home and they just simply they didn't talk. They didn't talk about what had taken place, and it was kind of the macho culture, a culture of masculinity that doesn't talk about what's happening inside. That coupled with this national celebration. Man, we just won the war. So why do you want to talk about something bad that's happening, or maybe something, the nightmares that you're having? I mean, you come home, you buy the refrigerator, you buy the house, you get married, you start having babies by the dozen. I mean, this is the post-war generation, right? So talking about you know stuff that you went through just wasn't on the radar. So Shifty, like so many guys, just kept its stuff down, stuff down, stuff down. And he talks about how he lost a lot of confidence after the war. Like when you're with your buddies and there's sort of this feeling like, man, you were 10 feet tall and bulletproof, right? And then you come home and it's just like, I don't know, I like, driving over to the nearby town, like that became hard for him. I don't want to go drive an hour to go see my sister because I don't know, I don't want to leave my town. And when I probed him a bit on that question, it was like, well, I don't want to leave the security of what I'm experiencing here. So he eventually did talk, and he had a great wife, Dorothy, who really helped him a lot. He got active in his church, and that really helped. He was actually baptized quite late in life, I think 45 or 50, when he just kind of went, I need a fresh start to everything. And so he talked to his pastor, and baptism was like one of the ways that was like symbolic to him as much as anything. I want to start new and start fresh. So he eventually did talk a lot and got through that and regained his confidence and went on to live a really good life. So
No, that's amazing. That's a fantastic story. So after Shifty, you're pretty much done with the Band of Brothers, but you haven't left the genre of military biography. And that kind of, I'm sure there were other projects, but I'm really anxious to talk about Blaze of Light and the story of Gary Beikirch. Could you tell me how did your agent bring you that one, or how did you meet Gary?
yeah, Gary, it was just being at the right time at the right place. And it's amazing how many books it kind of come that way where, I'm talking to this guy and he knows somebody who knows somebody who knows somebody. This with Gary's story, this guy had called me up and just asked me if he could talk about a book that he wanted to write. So we were talking about that, and then everything kind of wrapped up and we started talking about who did he know and who did I know and the stories of different guys. He started telling me about this Green Beret who had come home from Vietnam and then lived in a cave, and I was just like, what? I mean, tell me more. And so I fortunately Gary Beikirch, he kept a pretty robust presence on social media. So I looked him up and just sent him this email, just absolutely cold, introducing myself, talking about this friend of a friend, and I said, have you ever thought about writing a book? And he was like, he responded like right away. He goes, my wife and I have just been talking about this, going, time is short, and we're sort of in the last season here, and it's time for me to write a book. So it was just amazing, fortuitous timing there.
That's fantastic. Now, backtracking just briefly, when we talk about Band of Brothers, most folks, especially who watch the podcast, they've read the books, they've seen the movies, so we can go right into talking about personalities. Can you give a little thumbnail about Gary so people know obviously Special Forces, Medal of Honor recipient? I believe it was April of 1970 that he was his team came under attack, and he earned the Medal of Honor as a Special Forces medic. Correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Could you give a little bit more, just a background on the battle, or background on the acts that won him the Medal of Honor? I know a lot of people don't like the term "one" tied to the Medal of Honor, for which he received the Medal of Honor.
Awarded. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's nothing you win. And he made that clear with me. There was a learning curve to the Medal of Honor Society as well. So he is a Green Beret Special Forces medic. And he, again, a pretty soft-spoken guy. Definitely didn't get into the battle to, sort of shoot him up or whatever. He wanted to go there to help people, and he was definitely trained in weapons and sort of, knew the stuff there. But very compassionate guy. So he is sent to this little village called Dak Sang in Vietnam's Central Highlands region. It's a strategic village because it's pretty close to the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which is the main north-south supply route there for the communists. So everybody's kind of watching this village. I mean, the enemy's watching this village. The Americans are watching this village. The villagers are watching this village. Everybody's watching it. And he's there for months. Months go by, and Dak Sang is this jungle Shangri-La. He describes it like he's the main medic there, and there's 12 Green Berets in that village, about 400 Montagnard fighters, which is the indigenous fighting force there, and then about 2,300 women and children who are like the wives and the kids of the Montagnard fighters. So he becomes the main medic there, and he's doing everything. He is the doctor at age 22, right? He is delivering babies, he's giving tetanus shots, helping snake bites. I mean, whatever it is, and the villagers love him. I mean, finally, sort of somebody has come to help them out, and they want the Green Berets there, and that's a pretty interesting dynamic because Vietnam is it's kind of a cloudy war, but the Montagnard tribes, in the enemy's eyes, they were an inferior race, were seen as an inferior race, and the enemy had vowed to wipe the Montagnards off the face of the map. Okay, so they are welcoming all the support they can get, and they are literally in this fight for their survival. So they want the Green Berets there. So anyway, they're loving Gary, and for a number of months, all is just summer camp. I mean, Gary's talking about, they set up a volleyball net, and all the kids there, they take the kids down swimming in the river. They set up a sheet and they're showing John Wayne movies at night on the projector. I mean, it's just great. And Gary felt he had grown up in a family without his dad and stuff, and moved a lot as a kid, and so he really felt this sense of acceptance. They made Gary an honorary tribes member, and held a ceremony for him there. So he was really had felt this love, and then kind of turned around and felt this sense of, I have to fight for these people that I've come to love. So April 1st, 1970, just before dawn, what had happened is that during the night, the enemy had surrounded this camp, completely secret. And just as dawn breaks, the enemy, and it's like 10,000, literally 10,000 enemy forces had surrounded this little village. and they just start to shell it, just shell the crap out of it. And it's incoming, and just absolute chaos in this village. And you got to remember, there's, women and little kids in this village, and everybody's taking a pounding. So Gary is chief medic, and it's his job to help everybody in his sight. And he's sort of running here and running there and trying to help this person, that person, and he gets hit, and then gets hit again, and then gets hit a third time. Bam, bam, bam. He's hit in his back, his stomach, his hip. I mean, he is out for the count. He's paralyzed from the waist down. This bullet lodges right next to his spine, and he can't walk. I mean, he is out for the count. So here's this amazing part of the story: lying in the dirt, intestines literally like hamburger hanging outside of his body. And he calls these two helpers to him, and he says, "I've still got a job to do. Carry me, carry me." So they literally undergird him at his shoulders, and they're dragging him around the battlefield from one wounded person to another. And that's how he keeps doing his job. That's how he keeps administering aid on the battlefield. I'm going to help this guy. Okay, drag me to the next, one by one by one. So that's what he wins the Medal of Honor for. Or he's awarded the Medal of Honor.
That's absolutely amazing. Now, obviously, with wounds of that nature, and it's also, for me, an exciting part of the book, he has to be evacuated at some point. And if I recall, you kind of get into it right from the beginning that the evacuation wasn't going so well, and several aircraft were lost trying to get men out. Was he eventually evacuated out of the post?
Yeah, so it's a pretty hairy situation, and the first two helicopters don't make it, but finally the third one does, and it's like 6 seconds or 10 seconds of a landing. I mean, the helicopter comes straight down, and the guy's counting, the pilot's counting him, and he's like, "Okay, if you don't get this guy on the copter, on the chopper before this time is up, we're leaving without everybody." And fortunately, they're able to kind of literally throw Gary into the helicopter and get out of there, and just a absolutely crazy time.
And so I'm assuming he was evacuated, not, he has to go through, evacuation hospital, et cetera, but back to Japan and then eventually to the United States. How long was he in uh, long-term recovery and therapy from all those wounds?
Yeah, I think it was about a year and a half, and he's pretty beat up. The one of the amazing parts of his story happens in the hospital, because he is wavering in and out of death. And it's pretty funny. So Gary had said, when I was in college, I partied to a certain extent, and I knew what it was like to black out, from like drinking too much. But he said the type of blackout that was happening to me in the hospital was way different, because it was a darkness blackout. It was a death blackout. It's like I was wavering between life and death, and I knew it. And so he's such a self-sufficient guy, and he's Green Beret. And the whole point of his training is be prepared for everything, face every challenge fearlessly. You're the man. You're the self-sufficient man. So he's in the hospital. He goes, I could handle anything life gave me, but I couldn't handle whatever death gave me. And when he was blacking out, so darkly he went, and then he'd come back, and it's just like, I can't handle the idea of dying. So one day, this chaplain comes along and sits down next to Gary's bed, and Gary's just coming to, and the chaplain says, I've been coming by your bed for the last couple of days here, and you've been out of it, but now I see you're awake. Would you like to talk? And so they talk a little bit. And Gary is not a religious guy at all. I mean, he has never, sort of darkened the door of a church. But the chaplain asks him if he would like to pray. And Gary is like, "Pray? I don't know how to pray. Who do I pray to? I've never prayed in my life." And the chaplain says, "Well, that's okay, son. God knows how to listen." So Gary prays right there. He just prays, like, "I don't want to die," that type of thing. And it's certainly not a polished prayer, but Gary says that was a turning point. when he started looking beyond himself, and this very tiny seed of faith was born in his life, where he went, okay, if there is a God out there, maybe this God has kept me alive for a reason. So I want to discover this. And fortunately, that was the start of a pretty big turning point in Gary's life, where he pursued that path later on. Eventually, did make a full healing, regained the use of his legs, and today Gary is in fact the chaplain of the Medal of Honor Society. So faith is a pretty big piece of his journey.
That's absolutely amazing. Now, you had mentioned when you first heard about him, there was a point in time in which he was residing in a cave. How did that, how did that even come about on his journey? Uh, I'm,
Yeah,
I'm
so he comes home from the States, and he's got this seed of faith in his life, but his life is pretty messy still. I mean, it's uh, Gary describes sort of how he came to Jesus in pieces. There wasn't sort of a one big come to Jesus moment. It was kind of a step by step by step. So he comes back to the States, heals up some more, and then goes back to university. And his initial task is he wants to become a doctor because of his medical training. So he's enrolled in university, and unfortunately, like so many military personnel from that generation, it's just simply not a great time to be a veteran in the United States. So he literally gets harassed for being a veteran on the campus of his university, and he is pushed in the hallway. His books are pushed off his desk. He is spit upon, literally spit upon. There's this one pretty horrendous scene in the book where he's in his van in the university parking lot, and somehow this sort of small group of angry students finds out that he's there, and they surround the van and begin to push it. And then kind of everybody joins in, and this small little cadre of angry students becomes a pretty angry mob, taking out their fury on this guy who's saved lives back in Vietnam. So and they're shoving the van and pushing it and yelling at him. And, again, Gary's this green beret, and so if he had gotten out of his van, I'm sure he could have handled himself and at least gotten a few good punches in. But he doesn't. He just sort of gently backs out of the mob and takes off. But he's shaken. He's shaken in spirit, and he's just like, I can't handle the pressure of the culture right now. And so he decides to tune in, drop out. It's kind of the lingo of the day. He packs a little rucksack. He's got his guitar. He's got his journal. He's got the works of Thoreau and Walden Pond and whatnot. And Gary decides just to get out of there. So he hikes far out into the northern Appalachians, and he finds this cave. And he finds that when he is out in the wilderness, it is kind of the one time where his soul relaxes, and he can find his bearings. And so he's just like, if the only time in my life right now is when I'm out in the wilderness, I'm going to stay out in the wilderness. So he eventually he lives in this cave for like a year and a half. And I mean, it's a literal, 4 or 3.5 walls and a stone ceiling. And he's cooking his meals over a fire, and he's bathing in the stream, and it's full on cave living.
I'm assuming his training was able to help him make it somewhat livable compared to your average American who might be dropped off in the middle of the Appalachians.
Oh yeah, yeah. So he spends 2 winters in this cave. But because he's a Green Beret, he's like, well, I bundled up, but I got some extra insulation and whatnot. But yeah, like 2 winters in the mountains in a cave. I mean, that's what he does.
That's pretty impressive. And so when he sort of emerges from the mountains, was he was that almost like a clarifying experience, or was he just deciding, okay, I gotta figure out what the next chapter was? When he decides to come back to society, was that with a clear mind or just looking for the next thing?
Well, a couple things happen there when he's in the cave. So he's still enrolled in university, actually a different school at the time. So he's coming down every day to every other day to attend a couple of classes. And then in the evenings and afternoons, evenings overnight, he'll go back and hike and live out in the cave. So he's still maintaining some connections with civilization. he's got this PO box down in a little town, and he'll hike down and get his mail at this PO box. One day he hikes down, gets his mail, and there's a message for him in the box that says, "Hey, please be at this payphone tomorrow at such and such a time because an important phone call is coming for you." So he's like, okay. So the next day he hikes down, he's at the payphone. Sure enough, the payphone rings, and it's the Pentagon. And they say, okay, are you Sergeant Gary Beikirch, blah, 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 blah. And he says, yes, we have the pleasure of announcing to you that you have been awarded the Medal of Honor, the nation's highest and most prestigious honor for acts of valor. And Gary's like, you've got to be kidding. But it's no joke. And so he goes from living in a cave literally to the White House. He's awarded this honor from the president, and then flies back to Lancaster and hikes out into the wilderness and kind of shoves the medal into a duffel bag and doesn't touch it again for 7 years. Goes back to living in his cave. But what actually got him out of the cave uh, was a woman. When he's down in this town, getting his mail, he some months go by. He eventually meets this young lady, and her name is Lolly. And Lolly's this young teenage single mother. She's got a daughter, and she's like 19. And they strike up this friendship, and the friendship blossoms into a romance. And so Gary proposes. And Lolly says, "Yep, I'll marry you, but I'm not living in the cave." And so Gary's like, "Okay, I got a decision to make: either get married and get an apartment in town, or keep living in the cave and stay single." So he makes the wiser choice, as he says, and that gets him out of the cave.
That's amazing. I mean, if these stories, Shifty story, Buck's story, Gary's story, it's like if you saw it in a movie, you'd be like, you got to be kidding me. And these men are actually living these lives. It always blows me away. The one thing that I admire about Medal of Honor recipients is they seem to bear the decoration for their comrades. I've had the opportunity to meet a few, and there's comes back to that word you mentioned for both Shifty and Buck. There's this level of humility there. I imagine Gary also exhibits that same humility. Is he actively involved now in, well, he's the chaplain of the society, which is amazing, but is he a speaker? Does he go on tour to represent the society? How is he spending his time now?
Yeah, and a couple of things there. So one of the things where Gary started to actually wear the medal was fellow veterans said, "You've got to wear it for us, shine the spotlight." And Gary really gravitated toward that idea. It's not just about me, he would say. It is about every man who fought there, every woman as well. And so he wears it to shine the spotlight on heroic deeds throughout the community. So, and the question was, again, it's about what is he doing now today? Yeah. So Gary, he became a middle school guidance counselor eventually. Went and got his master's degree, and had just a fantastic career as a guidance counselor. Students know him as kind of the gentle and kind teacher and counselor who was always there for them, and his students just give a lot of praise to who he was in his career. After retirement, started speaking more on behalf of the society. Speaks all over the country. Um, the book came out, and then so actually he had beaten cancer. The book came out, and then the cancer has now returned. So right now, Gary is undergoing chemo pretty aggressively for pancreatic cancer. So he is, we speak a couple times every other week or so now, and we're on email all the time. And definitely am keeping tabs on that. It's an aggressive cancer, honestly, from what he says, and he's talked about it on social media, so it's it's not secretive there. And yeah, he just covets your thoughts and prayers, and hopefully he will make it through this time as well. So.
I think I could speak for my listeners and viewers that he will certainly be in our thoughts and prayers, definitely mine and my family. So that's just amazing, and just I really appreciate you making the time to share that story, and I'm hoping that this will motivate folks to get a copy of Blaze of Light and learn more about what this amazing warrior did, both as a special forces soldier and subsequently in life. Prior to starting the recording, you had mentioned you're currently working on a project that takes us back to World War II, but this time in the Pacific Theater. And I'd really like to hear a little bit more about that if you're willing to share something.
Yeah. So this is an exclusive to your viewership. Just last week, I signed a contract with a publisher here, and the book is tentatively titled "A Bright and Blinding Sun." It is the story of Joe Johnson, who is a 14-year-old enlistee in World War II, and he's trying to escape a kind of a troubled home situation. So he fibs about his age and signs up for the army. And it's before Pearl Harbor, so the war for America really isn't on yet. And gets sent to the Philippines with the 31st, and has a number of amazing adventures right in Manila, and and then Pearl Harbor breaks out, and so he is thrust into this fight for his life on Bataan, and is eventually taken captive during the surrender. And so he spends many of his formative teenage years as a prisoner of war at the hands of Imperial Japan. And that's the story in a nutshell, how this teenager makes it through the war.
That sounds fascinating. And you said it should come out sometime in the early summer of 2022.
Yeah, I think it's scheduled for just before Father's Day 2022
That's
release. So
very
yeah.
cool. We'll definitely be looking for that. Were you able, as you were researching the story, because I believe you mentioned that Mr. Johnson is deceased and you didn't have the opportunity to interview him, were you able to get material about his post-military life or career? Or does the book end with liberation in 1945?
He definitely struggled after the war, and I think being a prisoner of war, he went through some really horrific things where you have to adopt such a survival mentality. He fortunately left behind a real wealth of writings and videotapes and recordings. I've interviewed all his family and friends, and then just that period of time is well documented. So we've got a real wealth of information about his story. And yeah, he did struggle after the war for sure, but fortunately made it through that. And those who knew him in his latter years just talk about what a sweet and kind guy he was. He really had forgiven much and learned how to heal. So
That's amazing. Well, we will definitely be looking forward to learning more about it. Now, I think you'd mentioned the book's about a third of the way done now.
right now, about a third of the way done. Yeah.
And you're so how, if you we come up to the end of my time here, but I would like to hear a little bit about your process as a writer. Once you've got your research done and you're like, okay, now I'm going to set a schedule and I'm going to write a book. Do you set yourself a standard that you're going to write 8 hours a day, or you're going to achieve, I'm going to do 1,000 words today? How do you go about your craft, if you don't mind sharing some of that?
Yeah, so a former newspaper reporter, and we were taught in the newsroom we did 1,000 researched edited words a day. So that's kind of a pace that I try for. As a writer, I aim for about a chapter a week, although there's flexibility in that. I have three school-aged kids, so the hours I keep are fairly, sort of 8 to 5, 8 to 5:30, 8 to 6, whatever it is. So it is, yeah, if I can't get out there to go see a site, it's staying in seat and working the phones and working the books and nose to grindstone and getting it done that way. So
That's absolutely fascinating too, just to hear the process of being a writer. I think that's just really cool. That may not appeal to all my listeners, but I just, it gets me excited. I like to hear about that. When you research the books, any book, and obviously you're gonna want some illustrations, some maps, and things like that. Do you request them from families? Do you go into the archives? What governs the decisions of what's going to go into painting the pictures that go along with the words?
yeah, great question. It's a lot of it is my decision, although it's a decision I make in collaboration with the publisher, and in this case, the estate of Joe Johnson. So Joe fortunately left boxes and boxes of materials. So in sifting through that, I've got definitely my keep pile and my discard pile, and then my maybe pile. And there's always sort of more information than you can fit into a book. So it's amazing as well what gets left on the cutting room floor. I do work with graphic designers, and I've got my favorite map person who I've done some projects with, and I can sort of send her a sketch, and then she'll know what to do with it, and there's some back and forth there. And she's really good. It's like, well, how about if we include this as well, and maybe you should title that. And so with photographs, it's the whatever's in the family archives for sure. And then I'm also going to, I don't know, Library of Congress or whatever I can to help fill in gaps as well. So
So in the COVID age, are there online repositories? Because I'm assuming you can't get into the Library of Congress for the past year or so.
yeah, it's all online these days, and phone and email and scrambling, and yeah.
Well, I do want to thank you on behalf of readers of military history that you have a good map person, because there's nothing that steams my beans more than not being familiar with an area or terrain, but there's not an accompanying map. So it's that much more difficult to picture what's going on in a particular scenario or campaign. So thank you for making sure you have a good map person.
I like a good map, yeah.
Well, I'm just about out of time, Marcus. So I just want to thank you for coming on and sharing so much. This has been a fantastic interview. I definitely got more out of it than I anticipated going into it. For my viewers and listeners, you've been listening to the Commander's Voice. My guest today was Marcus Brotherton. He's got a very exciting project coming out in 2022. And the name of that book, one more time, Marcus, is?
Working title right now is a bright and blinding sun.
So definitely keep an eye out for a bright and blinding sun, but also he's, as we discussed during the entire interview, he's got a plethora of books out there. I highly recommend A Blaze of Light. It's my most recent read, and I'm really enjoying it. So Marcus, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you, Ben.